In the earliest years of the Great Crusade, when the Imperium of man was still young and the stars seemed filled with promise rather than dread, there existed a sense of rising inevitability, a belief that history itself had turned the page and would never again fall into darkness. Humanity had endured long ages of isolation before that time. Across uncounted worlds, descendants of old Earth had survived as best they could, cut off from one another by storms in the immaterial sea. Cultures had risen in solitude, some preserving fragments of ancient knowledge, others descending into superstition, tyranny, or slow decline. Many had forgotten that they were not alone. Then the storms thinned. From terror came a new force, disciplined, radiant, and vast beyond comprehension. Fleets bearing the sigil of the Imperium crossed the stars not as conquerors alone, but as heralds of reunification. At their head stood a figure spoken of in reverent tones, rarely seen by most, yet felt in every order carried across the void, the Emperor of mankind. He did not rule as a distant monarch concerned with ceremony. His authority moved like gravity, subtle yet absolute, shaping the destiny of humanity with a vision that spanned millennia. To some, he was a warlord of unmatched brilliance. To others, a philosopher king, restoring the rational light of human reason. To many more, he was simply the one being capable of ending the long night of division. The Great Crusade was not merely a military campaign. It was an act of reclamation. Expeditionary fleets translated into forgotten systems, their arrival often mistaken for myth or divine visitation. Some worlds greeted them with relief, their leaders eager to join a greater whole. Others resisted, clinging to sovereignty or misunderstanding the scale of what had returned to them. In each case, compliance came, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through demonstration of overwhelming strength. Yet even in conquest, there was purpose beyond domination. Lost technologies were recovered, archives restored, and trade routes reopened. The Emperor's dream was not of scattered empires, but of a single, coherent civilization stretching across the stars, bound by shared lore and enlightened by rediscovered knowledge. At the forefront of this expansion marched the Legiones Astartes, the Space Marine Legions, giants wrought through gene science and relentless training. Each legion bore the genetic legacy of a Primarch, a son of the Emperor engineered to be more than human, to serve as generals, governors, and exemplars of the new age. In those early decades, before pride and rivalry deepened into something darker, the legions were symbols of unity. Their banners flew side by side over newly compliant worlds. Their warriors shared victories and honored one another's traditions. Tales of their deeds spread ahead of the fleets, shaping the expectations of worlds yet to be found. Among these Primarchs was Horus, first discovered and longest at the Emperor's side. He stood as a bridge between the distant master of terror and the vast armies pushing outward into the unknown. Charismatic, perceptive, and swift in judgment, he embodied the optimism of the Crusade's early years. To many commanders and common soldiers alike, Horus seemed the living proof that the Emperor's vision could be understood, interpreted, and enacted by one who still walked among them. The Emperor himself was rarely present on the front line for long. His duties spanned the entire Imperium, and his mind was set to dwell on projects few could fully comprehend. When he did appear, it was often briefly, like a brilliant star glimpsed between clouds. Those encounters left lasting impressions, not of warmth, but of vastness, as if one had stood before a force of nature given human shape. In his absence, the machinery of compliance continued with quiet efficiency. Iterators, diplomats, and scholars followed in the wake of conquest, ensuring that worlds did not merely submit, but joined the Imperium in spirit as well as law. Old faiths were examined, sometimes tolerated, often set aside in favor of the imperial truth, a doctrine that denied the supernatural and proclaimed that humanity's destiny rested in its own hands. For many, this was liberation. Superstition had ruled countless planets, and the arrival of imperial reason brought medicine, engineering, and the promise of interstellar exchange. Starports replaced crumbling launch towers. Libraries grew where once only oral legend survived. Generations who had never seen the night sky lit by more than a single sun now learned they were part of a civilization spanning thousands of systems. There was a rhythm to the crusade in those days. Fleets advanced, established order, then moved on, leaving behind garrisons and administrators. New routes formed across the warp, each successful journey strengthening the sense that the galaxy could be mapped, measured, and ultimately understood. Confidence grew. It was said that humanity had been given a second beginning, and this time it would not squander the chance. The Emperor's sons, the Primarchs, were living proof that human potential had no ceiling. Where they walked, cities rose, armies rallied, and impossible feats became routine. Their presence inspired not only awe, but a kind of collective certainty that the future was already decided. Even worlds that had once feared the void began to look outward. Young officers requested transfer to expeditionary fleets. Scholars volunteered for colonial missions. The Imperium did not feel like an empire imposed from afar, but a tide drawing humanity together toward a shared horizon. Yet beneath this momentum lay quieter realities. The galaxy was not empty, nor was it uniformly welcoming. Xeno's empires resisted eradication, and some possessed technologies that rivaled or surpassed humanity's own. Warp routes, though more stable than before, still harbored unpredictability. Astropathic choirs sometimes fell silent without explanation, their messages swallowed by unseen currents. These concerns, however, were distant compared to the prevailing mood of triumph. Each new victory overshadowed the memory of setbacks. Losses were recorded, studied, and avenged, folded into the larger narrative of inevitable progress. From Terra, orders flowed with measured precision. Resources were allocated, legions reassigned, entire sectors prioritized for rapid integration. It was as if an immense design was being assembled piece by piece, visible only from a height few could imagine. Those who served at the highest levels understood that the Emperor worked toward an objective beyond mere expansion, a final state of unity and stability that would render the terrors of old night impossible to repeat. To the common citizen on a newly compliant world, this grand design was felt in smaller ways: a shipment of medical supplies that ended a lingering plague, an engineer corps restoring power grids that had flickered for generations, a teacher explaining that their son was one of billions bound under a single banner. Hope became ordinary. And yet, in the vastness of space, even the brightest dawn cast long shadows. There were moments, subtle and easily dismissed, when the machinery of the crusade seemed to strain. A campaign took longer than predicted. A world required harsher measures than expected. A Primarch disagreed, briefly but pointedly, with a directive from Terra. Such incidents were resolved, recorded, and filed away, but they hinted at the immense pressure of holding together something so vast, so diverse, and so driven by powerful personalities. Still, none could deny the scale of what had been achieved. In the span of a few short centuries, humanity had gone from scattered remnants to the dominant force in the galaxy. The Emperor's standard flew over more worlds than any ruler in history could have named. The dream of unity, once a distant philosophical ideal, had taken material form in fleets, fortresses, and thriving planetary capitals. It was an age that would later be remembered with longing, a time when the Imperium believed not only in survival, but in destiny. Far from Terra, on the edges of explored space, new systems continued to be charted. Some would become vital strongholds, guarding key warp routes and serving as anchors for further expansion. At the time, they were simply points of light on a growing map, their future significance unknown. Among these distant regions lay worlds that would one day stand at the crossroads of history. In the era of early triumph, they were just another horizon to be reached, another step in the endless advance of human endeavor. And so the fleets pressed on, their engines humming like a steady heartbeat in the void. Astropaths whispered messages across light years. Navigators peered into the shifting tides of the warp. On countless bridges, captains studied star charts glowing in the half-light, plotting the next translation, the next encounter, the next world to be welcomed into the fold. In those quiet hours between arrivals, when only the murmur of machines and the distant flicker of stars filled the viewports, there was time for reflection. Officers considered the magnitude of their mission. Remembrances drafted accounts of victories that already felt legendary. Even the transhuman warriors of the legions, silent and disciplined, carried within them the awareness that they were shaping an age that would echo through millennia. The Imperium moved forward with a calm assurance of something that believed itself unbreakable. And in the deep silence between the stars, that certainty drifted outward, bright and unwavering, like a beacon whose light had not yet met the storm. As the Great Crusade advanced beyond the well-charted corridors of the inner Imperium, the character of exploration began to change. The early decades of reunification had focused on worlds whose signals and histories still lingered in fragmentary records from old Earth. Now, the fleets pushed into regions where humanity's presence had faded so completely that even myth held no memory of it. Here, the stars seemed colder. Expeditionary armadas traveled longer between compliant systems, their journeys through the warp stretching into months of careful navigation. Astropathic messages arrived faint and delayed, like echoes from a great distance. Yet the purpose remained unchanged. Each new translation into real space carried the same ritual of arrival, scans of orbital space, broadcasting the formal cant of the Imperium, and the patient wait for response. Sometimes there was none. Dead worlds were not uncommon. Planets scarred by ancient bombardment or environmental collapse turned slowly beneath dim suns. On such spheres, the Mechanicum detachments worked in near silence, combing ruins for lost data while remembrances recorded the stark reminder of how fragile civilizations could be. These places were not counted as victories, yet they strengthened the Crusade's resolve. Humanity, it was said, would not allow itself to vanish so completely again. Other systems held stranger discoveries. Human-descended populations endured under rigid regimes shaped by isolation and fear. Some had turned inward, building fortress cities and distrusting the sky. Others had embraced rigid belief systems to explain the silence of the stars. When Imperial fleets appeared above them, reactions ranged from reverence to panic. In these encounters, the role of the Primarchs grew ever more vital. Their presence lent weight to negotiations that might otherwise have faltered. Towering figures clad in armor wrought like living sculpture, they spoke with authority that seemed to transcend mere rank. Though each differed in temperament, all shared the ability to make the Imperium feel tangible, not distant and abstract, but embodied in a leader who could be seen and heard. Horus, in particular, excelled in this role. He listened before he commanded, and many planetary rulers found in him a figure who seemed to understand both the burdens of power and the necessity of unity. Compliance achieved through his diplomacy often left worlds not merely subdued, but genuinely invested in the Imperium's future. Behind such moments of concord, however, stood the unspoken certainty of force. The Legiones Astartes remained the ultimate guarantors of imperial will. When negotiations failed, their assaults were swift and decisive, designed to end resistance before it could spread. Campaigns were planned with meticulous care, minimizing prolonged devastation while ensuring no doubt remained about the consequences of defiance. In the records of the era, these actions were described as regrettable necessities in service of a greater peace. To those who lived through them, they were simply the turning points after which their world's history aligned with a vast, unstoppable current. The Emperor's vision continued to guide all of this, though he was seldom present to witness the details. From Terra came directives that shaped entire sectors, redistributing fleets, assigning Primarchs to new theaters, and prioritizing routes that would bind the growing Imperium into a cohesive whole. His foresight was often remarked upon in private councils. Decisions whose logic was not immediately clear would, years later, reveal their wisdom as new threats or opportunities emerged. Such moments reinforced the belief that the Crusade unfolded according to a design few could fully grasp. Yet the distance between Terra and the front lines had consequences. Messages took time. Local commanders, Primarchs among them, increasingly exercised personal judgment in matters of governance and warfare. Most did so with discipline and loyalty, but subtle differences in interpretation began to appear. One legion might favor swift integration and cultural adaptation, another strict restructuring under imperial norms. These variations were tolerated, even valued, as long as they served a larger goal. Diversity of method, it was said, strengthened the Imperium's ability to face an unpredictable galaxy. Beyond the human sphere, resistance persisted. Xenos enclaves were encountered with growing frequency along the Crusade's widening perimeter. Some species withdrew at the first sign of Imperial presence, abandoning systems rather than face annihilation. Others fought with desperation born of knowing there would be no negotiated place for them in humanity's future. These wars were fought far from the core worlds and rarely disturbed the broader optimism of the age. Victories were announced, losses quietly absorbed, and the frontier pushed ever outward. For most citizens of the Imperium, such conflicts were distant stories carried by official bulletins and embellished by traveling chroniclers. On newly integrated planets, daily life steadily improved under imperial administration. Trade lanes brought materials and expertise once thought unattainable. Standardized laws replaced arbitrary rule. Children grew up learning that their world was one among countless others, all connected by shared allegiance. The sense of belonging to something vast and purposeful became part of ordinary existence. This was a true strength of the early Imperium, not only its fleets and armies, but the quiet transformation of perspective. Humanity no longer saw itself as scattered survivors, but as participants in a collective ascent. Still, in the quiet hours of long voyages, some commanders studied star maps with a more measured gaze. The regions ahead were increasingly uncharted, their warp routes unstable, their histories unknowable. Each advance required greater commitment of resources, longer supply lines, and deeper trust in the structures holding the Imperium together. Confidence remained, but it was no longer effortless. It was maintained through discipline, faith in leadership, and the steady repetition of success. On distant bridges lit by the glow of hololithic displays, officers marked new systems for future compliance. In strategiums deep within capital ships, Primarchs reviewed reports and weighed decisions that would shape entire civilizations. And far away, on Terra, the Emperor continued his unseen labors, pursuing aims that stretched beyond the immediate horizon of conquest. The Great Crusade moved forward like a vast tide, its surface calm, its depths immense and largely hidden. Those carried upon it felt the motion but could not see the far shore toward which they traveled. And so the fleets pressed on into the widening dark, their path illuminated by duty, ambition, and an enduring belief that humanity's destiny lay not behind it, but waiting among the unclaimed stars. In the middle years of the Great Crusade, when expansion had become routine and the map of human space broadened with steady certainty, the Imperium began to take on a more defined shape. What had once been a surge of rediscovery was settling into structure, law, and expectation. The great endeavor no longer felt like a desperate reclamation of lost kin, but the deliberate construction of a lasting order. Across thousands of systems, patterns emerged. Worlds newly brought into compliance were no longer isolated sparks of reconnection, but parts of expanding sectors linked by stable warp corridors and regular patrol routes. Administrators trained on Terra and Mars took up residence in planetary capitals, bringing with them standardized codes of governance. Tithes were assessed not as punishment, but as participation in a shared enterprise, resources flowing outward to sustain fleets, research, and further expansion. For many citizens, the Imperium's presence became associated with predictability. Starships arrived on schedule. Astropathic choirs maintained regular contact. Disputes between worlds were settled through imperial courts rather than drawn-out wars. The vastness of space remained, but it was threaded now with lines of communication and authority that made it feel navigable, almost familiar. At the highest levels, the Primarchs played an increasingly visible role in shaping this order. Their campaigns were not solely martial. They founded academies, reorganized industries, and advised on planetary development. Each brought a distinct philosophy to these tasks, informed by the cultures in which they had first risen to power. Some emphasized strict discipline and uniformity. Others encouraged local traditions so long as loyalty remained firm. These differences were recorded with interest by imperial scholars, who saw in them the living expression of humanity's diversity unified under a single purpose. Horus continued to stand at the center of this constellation of leaders. His reputation for balancing strength with understanding made him a frequent intermediary between legions and civil authorities. Where tensions arose, he often resolved them through presence alone, his confidence lending reassurance that the Emperor's design encompassed all perspectives. To those who served near him, Horus appeared tireless, moving from war council to diplomatic audience with equal focus. He spoke often of the future, not in grand abstractions, but in practical terms of stable borders, thriving trade, and a generation that would know the galaxy as home rather than threat. Yet even in this era of consolidation, reminders of uncertainty persisted. Warp travel, though more reliable than in ages past, remained an art as much as a science. Navigators reported subtle shifts in familiar routes, currents that required constant recalibration. Most adjustments were minor, absorbed into routine procedures, but they served as quiet warnings that the medium through which the Imperium connected itself was not entirely under control. Similarly, not all human cultures adapted easily to imperial doctrine. The imperial truth, with its firm rejection of superstition and the supernatural, clashed with belief systems that had shaped societies for centuries. Iterators worked patiently to replace faith with reason, yet the process was not always smooth. Some populations complied outwardly while holding old convictions in private, a tension noted but not fully resolved. These challenges did not slow the crusade, but they added layers of complexity beneath its confident surface. The Emperor remained a distant presence, his appearances rarer as his attention turned increasingly toward undertakings on terror that few understood. When he did address his sons or senior commanders, his words carried the weight of vast perspective. He spoke of humanity's need for unity not only in territory, but in thought, a species aligned in purpose, resilient against forces that thrived on division. Those who heard him felt both inspired and humbled, aware that they grasped only fragments of the greater design. Among the fleets, daily life continued with disciplined rhythm. Training drills echoed through the cavernous holds of warships. Tech priests tended to engines whose operation bordered on ritual. Remembrances documented not just battles, but the quieter details of the age, the first interstellar festivals between newly linked worlds, the exchange of art and language, the slow weaving together of once isolated cultures. A sense of destiny still pervaded these accounts, but it was tempered now by awareness of scale. The Imperium was no longer a rising wave. It was an ocean, vast and requiring constant care to remain whole. On distant frontos, garrison worlds were established at key junctions of warp routes, their fortifications designed to secure the arteries of expansion. At the time, these strongholds were viewed simply as prudent safeguards, anchors of stability in a living network. Their future significance was not yet apparent, even to those who built them. In council chambers aboard flagships and in marble halls on compliant capitals, leaders spoke of a coming era when the crusade would slow, when exploration would give way to stewardship. Humanity would turn from reclaiming its scattered domains to cultivating them, building a civilization that could endure without constant war. It was an appealing vision, and for a time, it seemed within reach. Still, beyond the mapped regions, the galaxy stretched on, ancient and unknowable. Signals flickered at the edge of detection, ruins orbited silent stars, and phenomena defied easy explanation. Each mystery was logged for future investigation, deferred in favor of more immediate objectives. The Imperium advanced, confident that there would always be time to understand what it passed along the way. And so, beneath the ordered movement of fleets and the steady growth of human dominion, there lingered a quiet truth, that even the grandest design must contend with forces beyond foresight, and that the calm of an age can carry within it the first, almost imperceptible tremors of change. For now, however, those tremors went largely unnoticed. The stars shone with the same distant light they always had, and the ships of the Great Crusade sailed on between them, bearing with them a dream so vast that few could imagine it ever faltering. As the Imperium matured, the nature of its great endeavors subtly shifted from relentless expansion to careful reinforcement. The early fervor of rediscovery had not faded, but it was now matched by an awareness that what had been built must be made enduring. Conquest alone could not secure humanity's future. Stability would be its true shield. Across compliant space, vast construction efforts reshaped planets that had once stood alone in silence. Orbital docks grew into permanent shipyards, their skeletal frames lit by the steady glow of plasma furnaces. Surface cities expanded outward in ordered tiers, designed to house swelling populations drawn by opportunity and connection. Agricultural worlds were surveyed and optimized, their yields feeding not just themselves but distant systems linked by reliable trade routes. The Imperium was learning to breathe as a single organism. Administratum adept compiled records on a scale never before attempted, cataloging populations, industries, and resources with meticulous precision. What had once been isolated data became part of a living tapestry of information, allowing decisions made on terror to ripple outward with calculated intent. The scale of this effort was beyond comprehension for most, yet its effects were felt everywhere. In the timely arrival of supplies, the allocation of defense forces, and the coordinated response to crises. At the heart of these developments lay an unshaken faith in the Emperor's vision. Though he remained distant, his influence was present in every structure raised and every law enacted. He had set humanity upon a path that led away from fragmentation and toward a unified destiny. Those who serve in his name believed they were not merely administrators or soldiers, but custodians of a future that would outlast them by millennia. The Primarchs, too, took on new responsibilities in this era of consolidation. No longer were they solely commanders of advancing hosts. They became architects of governance. Some oversaw the fortification of strategic corridors, ensuring that vital warp routes were protected by layered defenses. Others devoted attention to education and cultural integration, establishing institutions meant to foster loyalty not through fear, but through shared identity. These efforts bore fruit in subtle ways. Trade guilds spanning multiple systems began to form. Scholarly exchanges flourished, with knowledge flowing more freely than at any time since humanity first reached the stars. Artistic traditions blended, producing works that reflected not one world's history, but a collective human story. Such developments reinforced the belief that the Imperium was more than a military alliance. It was becoming a civilization in the fullest sense, diverse, interconnected, and aware of itself as a single entity. Yet the demands of maintaining this vast structure were immense. Supply lines stretched across light years, dependent on warp passages that required constant vigilance. Patrol fleets rotated through distant sectors, their presence a real assurance against threats both known and unforeseen. Every game brought new obligations, new territories to defend, new populations to support. Still, morale remained high. Each challenge overcome strengthened confidence in the Imperium's resilience. Reports of hardship were met not with despair, but with resolve. The prevailing belief held that humanity, united at last, could adapt to any trial. On Terra, monumental works continued in silence behind guarded walls. Rumors of great projects circulated among senior officials, undertakings said to secure humanity's long-term survival in ways not yet revealed. The Emperor's attention was increasingly drawn inward, toward these hidden labors, leaving the Primarchs and their commanders to enact his will across the stars. This gradual withdrawal was understood as necessity rather than absence. The Crusade had reached a scale where delegation was essential. Trust in his sons and in the institutions he had forged was, in itself, a testament to how far the Imperium had come. In the fleets, life settled into a steady cadence. Generations of void-born crew now served alongside one another, their families' histories intertwined with the ships they called home. Rituals of departure and arrival took on the familiarity of tradition. Even the Astartes, engineered for war, experienced longer intervals between major campaigns, using the time to train, reflect, and study the worlds they had helped bring into the fold. There was, in these quieter stretches, a sense of standing at the threshold of a new epoch, one in which the Imperium would shift from expansion to endurance. Far along the frontier, certain systems were marked for special attention due to their position along critical warp junctions. Fortresses were raised in orbit and on barren moons, their purpose purely defensive, their existence a precaution against dangers not yet fully defined. At the time, such measures were viewed as prudent strategy, the natural evolution of a growing interstellar state. Few considered that these distant bastions might one day stand as more than way stations. The wider galaxy remained largely unknown, its depths holding mysteries beyond even the Emperor's far-reaching plans. Yet for the Imperium of this age, the unknown inspired determination rather than fear. Humanity had faced extinction before and endured. Now, stronger than ever, it believed itself ready for whatever lay ahead. And so the great work continued, slower now, more deliberate, like a master builder reinforcing the foundations of a towering structure. Each world integrated, each route secured, each generation raised within the imperial fold added another layer of permanence to the dream first kindled on Terra. In quiet observation decks overlooking the endless stars, officers and remembrances sometimes paused to consider the scale of it all. The galaxy seemed less like a wilderness and more like a vast estate slowly being brought to order. There was comfort in that thought, a real assurance that chaos was retreating before the steady advance of human purpose. The Imperium, vast and confident, rested for a moment in the belief that its foundations were strong, its future assured, and its light destined to shine undimmed across the ages. In time, the forward momentum of the Great Crusade began to carry the Imperium into regions where the familiar patterns of expansion grew less certain. The well-traveled arteries of human space lay far behind many expeditionary fleets, and with distance came a quiet awareness that the galaxy remained far older and more complex than even the Emperor's grand design could fully encompass. The tone of exploration changed in these outer reaches. Stars burned just as brightly, and planets turned in their ancient orbits, yet the sense of entering well-lit halls gave way to that of walking through vast, uncharted chambers. Long-range augurs detected anomalies that defied immediate classification. Ruined constructs of unmistakably non-human origin drifted in silent systems, their purposes lost to time. Some were carefully documented and left undisturbed. Others were dismantled, their materials studied by the Mechanicum with patient fascination. These discoveries did not slow the crusade, but they deepened its texture. Humanity was no longer merely rediscovering itself. It was confronting the layered history of a galaxy that had hosted countless civilizations, many of which had risen and fallen long before mankind first looked to the stars. Among the Primarchs, discussions of long-term strategy grew more frequent. With so much territory already brought into compliance, questions arose about how far the Imperium truly needed to extend. Some argued for consolidation, strengthening what had already been claimed. Others maintained that security lay in continued expansion, in pushing threats ever farther from the human core. Such debates remained respectful, framed by shared loyalty to the Emperor's purpose. Differences in emphasis did not yet harden into division. They were seen instead as signs of a living, adaptive leadership grappling with an immense task. Horus often acted as a mediator in these exchanges. His experience of the Emperor's side lent weight to his counsel, and his instinct for balance reassured those who feared either overextension or stagnation. He spoke of the Imperium as a growing organism that must expand and fortify in equal measure, never allowing one impulse to eclipse the other. Beneath these strategic concerns, daily life within the Crusade continued with practice efficiency. New generations of officers, born into the era of expansion, knew nothing of old Knight except through historical instruction. To them, the Imperium was not a fragile restoration but a natural state of being. They served with calm assurance, confident that the structures around them were permanent. This confidence extended even to the warp, that ever-present medium of travel and communication. Though still approached with ritual caution, it was increasingly treated as a master domain rather than an unpredictable abyss. Navigators charted routes with growing precision. Astropathic relays formed chains of near-continuous contact across vast distances. And yet, there were moments when the veil seemed thinner. Ships sometimes emerged from translation reporting dreams among the crew that lingered with unusual clarity, or instruments that registered fleeting disturbances without clear source. Such incidents were catalogued and investigated, usually attributed to natural fluctuations in the immaterium. They were not considered omens, merely data points in the ongoing effort to understand complex environment. Still, their accumulation formed a quiet undercurrent of unease for those inclined to reflection. On compliant worlds far from the front lines, the Imperium's presence grew ever more ingrained. Children learned standardized histories that began not with their planet's founding myths, but with terror and the unification of mankind. Local identities remained, but they were woven into a broader narrative that emphasized shared origin and destiny. Festivals marking compliance anniversaries became common, celebrating not conquest, but connection. Delegations traveled between systems for trade and cultural exchange, their journeys routine in a way that would have seemed miraculous only generations before. The success of these integrations reinforced a belief that the Emperor's vision was not only achievable, but inevitable. Yet inevitability is a fragile perception. In remote garrisons and listening posts at the edge of map space, watch officers sometimes observed phenomena that did not fit neatly into established categories. Faint signals of unknown origin flickered and vanished. Sensor ghosts appeared where no vessels could be confirmed. Most proved harmless or illusory upon closer examination, but each served as a reminder that the Imperium's knowledge, vast as it was, remained incomplete. The response to such uncertainty was not fear, but diligence. Patrol routes were adjusted, monitoring stations reinforced, reports forwarded up the long chain of command toward Terra, where they joined countless other fragments of information contributing to the Emperor's hidden calculations. Throughout it all, the overarching mood of the age held steady. Humanity stood united as never before, guided by leaders of unparalleled capability, driven by a vision that promised not merely survival, but flourishing on a galactic scale. Setbacks occurred, mysteries endured, but they seemed small against the monumental progress already achieved. In the quiet hours aboard ships gliding between the stars, officers sometimes contemplated how future generations would remember this time. They imagined it as a dawn of a golden era, when courage and reason had banished the shadows of past. It was difficult to conceive that such momentum could ever falter. Beyond the viewports, the galaxy stretched on in silent immensity, its distant light serene and indifferent. The Imperium moved among them with growing confidence, laying claim not only to territory, but to the belief that its rise was part of a larger, unfolding order. And in that belief, Calm and steadfast, the great endeavor continued onward into the deepening night, unaware of how even the most carefully built foundations may one day be tested by forces still hidden beyond the horizon. As the Great Crusade pressed deeper into the outer reaches of known space, the Imperium's vast machinery continued to function with disciplined precision. Yet within its steady rhythm there emerged a subtle shift, not in loyalty, nor in purpose, but in burden. The sheer magnitude of what had been created began to rest more heavily upon those entrusted with its direction. The Emperor remained upon Terra for longer intervals, immersed in undertakings shielded from even his closest advisors. His absence from the front lines was neither abandonment nor retreat. It was a redirection of focus toward objectives that required solitude and absolute concentration. Still, for the Primarchs and their commanders, the physical distance carried symbolic weight. They now stood as the most visible embodiments of imperial authority across an ever-widening galaxy. With that visibility came expectation. Each Primarch commanded not merely a legion, but a reputation. Their campaigns were scrutinized, their judgments discussed in councils both formal and private. Worlds newly brought into compliance measured the Imperium through the conduct of these towering figures. A single decision, a single deviation from expected protocol, could ripple outward across entire sectors. Horus, long accustomed to leadership, bore this scrutiny with composed assurance. As War Master in all but name during certain campaigns, he coordinated, whose combined strength rivaled that of entire sub-empires from humanity's distant past. His strategic brilliance lay not only in battlefield maneuver, but in harmonizing disparate forces into coherent action. Yet even he could not be everywhere at once. The crusade had grown too vast for any single mind to oversee entirely. Communications, though improved, remained bound by the limitations of warp travel and astropathic strain. Orders issued from one edge of imperial space might take weeks to reach another. In that interval, circumstances could change in unpredictable ways. Thus, initiative became a defining feature of this era. Fleet commanders were empowered to act decisively without awaiting direct approval from Terra. Sector governors made judgments shaped by local realities. The Imperium trusted in the strength of its structure, confident that shared doctrine and loyalty would guide these decentralized decisions toward common purpose. For a time, this trust proved well placed. Campaigns were executed with efficiency. Rebellions were contained swiftly. Trade flourished along secured corridors. The Legiones Astartes maintained a reputation as instruments of overwhelming resolve, yet also as guardians of stability. To most observers, the Imperium appeared not only powerful, but adaptable. Still, adaptation carries complexity. Differences in interpretation of imperial doctrine became more pronounced as distance from Terra increased. Some commanders favored strict adherence to standardized systems, reshaping compliant worlds to mirror the administrative heart of the Imperium. Others permitted broader local autonomy, believing that loyalty rooted in cultural continuity would prove more enduring. These approaches did not yet conflict openly. They coexisted within the wide umbrella of shared allegiance. Yet the seeds of divergence were present, subtle variations in philosophy that, under sufficient strain, might yield unpredictable outcomes. Amid this evolving landscape, the ordinary citizens of the Imperium continued to experience the benefits of unity. On industrial worlds, production quotas were met with growing efficiency, supplying fleets that ranged farther than ever before. On agricultural planets, surplus harvests ensured that distant garrisons remained provisioned. Across the stars, the sense of participating in something immense and purposeful persisted. Even so, there were whispers among certain scholarly circles about the sustainability of endless expansion. The galaxy was not infinite in habitable worlds, nor in easily accessible resources. Each new conquest required defense. Each garrison required supply. The Imperium's strength lay in momentum, but momentum required constant renewal. Such considerations were not widely discussed beyond strategic councils. Publicly, the narrative remained one of steady triumph. Beyond human domains, alien powers observed with varying degrees of alarm. Some withdrew further into obscurity. Others began to fortify their own territories in anticipation of inevitable confrontation. The galaxy, though vast, was not passive. It reacted to the Imperium's advance in ways that were not always immediately visible. In certain remote regions, contact was lost with exploratory vessels for longer periods than expected. Most re-established communication eventually, attributing delays to warp turbulence or navigational recalibration. A few did not return at all. These absences were recorded with solemnity, their causes left unresolved but assumed to be part of the inherent risk of interstellar endeavor. Through it all, the Emperor's vision remained a guiding constant. He had foreseen a humanity united not merely by force, but by shared rational purpose, a species no longer prey to ignorance or superstition. His sons, the Primarchs, were intended as exemplars of that enlightened strength. Yet exemplars are still individuals. They possess distinct temperaments, loyalties shaped by the worlds that had nurtured them before their rediscovery. While bound by genecraft and oath, they were not identical reflections of one another. The diversity that enriched the Imperium also introduced complexity into its leadership. For now, that complexity enriched rather than endangered the whole. Councils ended in agreement. Campaigns concluded in success, and the fleets continued their measured advance. In the quiet intervals between translations, as ships drifted through the luminous currents of the warp, senior officers sometimes reflected on the paradox of their age. Humanity had never been so unified, nor so powerful. Yet it had also never been so dispersed. Its authority stretched across distances that defied easy comprehension. The Imperium endured because its foundations were strong and its leaders resolute. But the weight of command, immense and unrelenting, rested upon shoulders both mortal and transhuman alike. And as the stars slid silently past observation decks and command thrones, the great enterprise pressed onward, carrying with it not only ambition and hope, but the quiet gravity of responsibility that accompanies all empires at their height. By the later decades of the Great Crusade's early expansion, a curious stillness began to settle between its triumphs. Not a stillness of inactivity, nor of retreat, but of measured pause, the kind that follows great exertion, when breath is drawn not in exhaustion, but in preparation for what lies further ahead. The Imperium's borders, though ever shifting, had reached a breadth that defied simple description. Star charts once dominated by unknown regions were now threaded with imperial designations, trade routes, and defensive perimeters. What had begun as a surge of rediscovery had matured into a vast, structured presence that seemed, for the moment, stable. It was in this atmosphere that reflection found room to grow. Among the Legiones Astartes, period between major campaigns lengthened. Training continued without pause, for war was never considered distant, yet there was time now for contemplation, for study, and for the quiet reinforcement of bond between warriors forged across decades of shared struggle. Veterans spoke of early battles with a tone not of nostalgia, but of recognition. They understood they had witnessed the forging of something that would define ages. Human officers and remembrancers, too, recorded more than mere victories. They documented the rhythms of life aboard ships that had become floating cities, the traditions forming among void-born families, the emergence of a culture shaped as much by the stars as by any single world. These accounts spoke of a civilization learning to exist in motion, carried forward by fleets whose journeys never truly ended. On compliant planets, the presence of the Imperium became less an event and more an enduring reality. Generations grew to adulthood knowing no other allegiance. Planetary defense forces trained according to standardized doctrine. Administrators communicated routinely with sector capitals light years away. The extraordinary had become familiar. Yet familiarity brought subtle change. Where once the arrival of an imperial fleet inspired awe or fear, it now often prompted orderly procedure. Docking bays were cleared. Formal delegations assembled. Data exchanges began almost immediately. The Imperium had become part of the expected structure of existence, its authority woven into the daily functioning of countless societies. This normalization was a sign of success, and it was celebrated quietly in reports sent toward Terra. The Emperor's dream was taking root not only in territory, but in mindset. Humanity was beginning to think of itself as one people by default, not by decree. Still, the galaxy beyond remained vast and largely unclaimed. Explorative vessels ranged ahead of the main fleets, mapping warp currents and cataloging phenomena that would guide future expansion. Their reports carried both promise and caution. New habitable systems identified alongside regions where the immaterium churned with unusual volatility. Such warnings did not halt progress, but they encouraged prudence. Routes were adjusted, way stations established. The Imperium advanced with a growing appreciation for the need to balance ambition with patience. Within high councils of the Crusade's leadership, discussions increasingly turned toward longevity. What institutions would endure once the era of constant campaigning slowed? How would unity be preserved across distances so immense that even astropathic communication strained to bridge them? These were not doubts, but considerations of stewardship, the responsibilities of those who believed they were building something meant to last indefinitely. Horus often spoke in these councils of legacy. Victory, he suggested, was only the first step. What mattered was what followed. A world brought into compliance must be guided toward stability, prosperity, and a sense of belonging. Without these, conquest would remain hollow, and unity would weaken over time. His words carried weight, reflecting a perspective shaped by years of the Emperor's side. Many who heard him felt reassured that the Imperium's future lay in capable hands. And yet, even amid this confidence, the Crusade's leaders were not untouched by the scale of their undertaking. Reports flowed in ceaselessly, minor uprisings, logistical shortfalls, unexplained anomalies. Each was addressed, resolved, or filed for further study. But their sheer number hinted at the constant vigilance required to maintain such an expansive realm. The Imperium was not a static monument. It was a living system, demanding attention at every level. In quiet observation chambers aboard flagships, some commanders found themselves gazing longer than before into the depths of space. The stars, distant and indifferent, offered no assurance that the current balance would endure forever. They were reminders that the galaxy had witnessed countless rises and falls, and that permanence was an aspiration, not a guarantee. Yet these reflections did not breed despair. Instead, they deepened resolve. If eternity could not be assumed, it must be pursued through diligence, unity, and foresight. So the Great Crusade continued, no longer with the breathless urgency of its earliest years, but with a steady, deliberate pace of an empire aware of its own magnitude. Victory still came, banners still rose over new worlds, but between those moments lay stretches of quiet labor, planning, building, reinforcing. It was in these intervals, unmarked by dramatic conquest, that the true foundations of the Imperium were laid. Hey, in the patient weaving together of systems and societies, the dream of lasting unity took its most durable form. And as fleets drifted in orderly formation through the star-strewn dark, their engines a distant murmur against the silence of the void, the Imperium rested briefly in the calm between victories, unaware of how precious such calm might one day seem. In the widening span of the Great Crusade, there came a period when confidence seemed to crystallize into doctrine. The Imperium had endured trial after trial, and had emerged not diminished, but strengthened. Its fleets had crossed regions once thought impossible. Its legions had overcome adversaries who believed themselves secure in ancient dominions. Humanity stood ascendant, and a belief in its destined supremacy hardened into quiet certainty. Across the breadth of imperial space, great cartographic vaults were filled with star maps etched in luminous detail. Systems once marked with uncertainty now bore classifications, population estimates, tide grades, and defense assessments. What had been an expanding frontier began to resemble a structured domain. This transformation altered perception. To the early pioneers of the Crusade, the galaxy had seemed immeasurable, a dark ocean whose shores could not be glimpsed. To the new generation raised within imperial order, it appeared chartable, divisible, ultimately containable. There remained unexplored regions, yes, but these were seen as temporary absences of knowledge rather than permanent mysteries. Such thinking was not born of arrogance alone. It was reinforced daily by tangible success. Warp corridors stabilized under repeated use. Astropathic choirs synchronized with remarkable reliability. Supply convoys traveled routes so frequently that their passage became routine, like the turning of seasons on a single world. The Imperium had become accustomed to functioning at scale. On distant bastion worlds established along critical junctions, fortifications expanded beyond their original purpose. What had begun as defensive outposts evolved into thriving hubs of military and administrative coordination. Shipyards orbited gas giants in constant construction. Regiments of the Imperial Army rotated through training cycles designed to prepare them for threats that, for the moment, remained largely hypothetical. The Legiones Astartes, though still instruments of decisive force, found themselves increasingly engaged in deterrence rather than prolonged warfare. Their mere presence in the sector often prevented resistance from coalescing. The legend of their might traveled faster than their fleets, shaping expectations long before first contact. Among the Primarchs, A shared understanding developed that they were no longer merely reclaiming a lost inheritance. They were shaping the framework within which humanity would exist for ages. Their decisions now carried implications measured not in years, but in centuries. Horus, ever attentive to morale and cohesion, encouraged collaboration between legions and civilian authorities. He recognized that strength alone could not sustain the Imperium indefinitely. Unity required not only fear of reprisal, but belief in common purpose. Under his guidance, joint initiatives flourished, military academies founded on compliant worlds, infrastructure projects supervised by Astartes engineers, cultural exchanges meant to foster mutual respect. These measures deepened the sense that the Imperium was more than an occupying force. It was an integrating presence. Yet as certainty grew, so too did the distance from memory of vulnerability. Few among the younger officers had witnessed the fragmentation of old night. The idea that humanity might once again fracture seemed increasingly abstract. Security appeared woven into the very fabric of existence. Even reports of irregular phenomena in the warp were often received with analytical detachment. Fluctuations were charted, anomalies catalogued, mitigation strategies devised. The unknown was treated as a technical challenge rather than an existential threat. Still, there were those who sensed that no map, however detailed, could fully account for the depths of the galaxy. Explorative fleets occasionally encountered regions where instruments faltered and navigation grew imprecise. In such places, the stars themselves seemed veiled, their light distorted by unseen currents. These zones were marked for caution and bypassed when feasible. Official records described them in measured language, devoid of speculation. But privately, some navigators spoke of a subtle resistance in these areas. Not active hostility, but an impression that the galaxy did not yield all its secrets willingly. On Terra, the Emperor's work continued in silence. The Primarchs received fewer direct communiques, yet the instructions that did arrive bore unmistakable intent. Priorities shifted towards securing specific routes and reinforcing particular systems whose strategic value was emphasized with unusual clarity. These directives were followed without question. Trust in the Emperor's foresight remained absolute among his sons. Across the Imperium, monuments were raised to commemorate milestones of expansion. In marble halls and vast plazas, statues depicted the unification of humanity and the triumph over isolation. Such symbols were not merely celebratory. They were instructional, reinforcing the narrative of inevitable progress. The mood of the age was one of poised assurance. And yet, beyond the luminous web of established routes and fortified systems, the galaxy remained vast, ancient, and patient. Its history stretched back far beyond humanity's brief ascendancy. Civilizations had risen before, some perhaps believing their dominion secure. The Imperium did not dwell on such comparisons. Its focus lay forward, not backward. The Great Crusade continued to press outward, though at a more measured pace, consolidating gains and extending influence where prudent. In the quiet corridors of capital ships, where starlight filtered through reinforced viewports, officers sometimes allowed themselves a moment of stillness. They would observe the slow drift of distant suns and consider how far humanity had come in so short a span. It was easy, in those moments, to believe that the path ahead was clear. The fleets maintained their formation. The bastions stood firm. The legions remained loyal and strong. The Emperor's vision guided all. And in the far reaches of certainty, where maps glowed with imperial sigils and confidence flowed as steadily as warp-traveled commerce, the Imperium rested in conviction that its foundations were unshakable, even as a wider galaxy, vast and inscrutable, watched in silence. As the Great Crusade entered a more measured phase, the Imperium's outward expansion continued, but with greater deliberation than before. The map of human space, once a scattering of rediscovered embers, now resembled a broad and luminous constellation. Trade routes pulsed with movement. Astropathic wires sustained near-constant communication between distant sectors. The machinery of unity, so long in construction, appeared to function with quiet reliability. And yet, within that reliability, there were moments that invited close attention. Reports reached sector commands of subtle irregularities in warp translation times. Journeys along well-established routes occasionally concluded either sooner or later than predicted, without clear navigational cause. Such discrepancies were small, often attributed to natural turbulence in the immaterium, but their frequency was noted by those responsible for long-term planning. The warp had always been a domain of shifting currents, and so these variations did not inspire alarm. They were recorded, analyzed, and integrated into revised charts. The Imperium had grown accustomed to mastering difficulty through method and persistence. Elsewhere, on frontier worlds still adapting to imperial governance, cultural tensions surfaced in muted forms. Some populations struggled to reconcile ancestral beliefs with the rational doctrine of the imperial truth. Compliance had been achieved, infrastructure improved, and prosperity increased, yet beneath the surface lingered traditions that resisted easy dissolution. Iterators and educators approached these matters with patience, confident that time and exposure to broader human culture would erode lingering superstition. For the most part, they were correct. Generational change proved a powerful force. Still, these quiet frictions served as reminders that unity was not merely declared, it was cultivated. Among the Legiones Astartes, campaigns grew less frequent but more complex. The remaining independent human polities often possessed unique technologies or defensive strategies developed in isolation. Bringing them into the Imperium required not only strength, but adaptability. Each engagement became a study in balance between decisive force and preservation of valuable knowledge. The Primarchs, overseeing such operations, bore the increasing weight of nuance. They were no longer simply conquerors. They were stewards of integration, responsible for ensuring that what was gained strengthened the whole rather than burdened it. Horus continued to exemplify this balance. His councils emphasized understanding the character of each world before determining its path to compliance. Such deliberation slowed some campaigns, yet the long-term stability achieved often justified the patience invested. Beyond the human sphere, Xenos encounters persisted at the margins. Some species displayed signs of strategic withdrawal, abandoning contested regions rather than face imperial advance. Others adopted indirect methods, avoiding open confrontation while probing defenses and supply lines. These patterns were studied carefully by imperial tacticians, who adjusted patrol deployments accordingly. Though these conflicts rarely threatened the Imperium's core, they underscored a quiet truth. The galaxy was not empty, nor was it static. It responded, adapted, and sometimes resisted in ways not immediately visible. In the administrative heartlands, the scale of governance reached unprecedented complexity. Entire departments of the administratum were dedicated solely to maintaining accurate records of fleet movements and resource flows. Delays in a single subsector could ripple outward, affecting campaigns light years away. Coordination became both art and science, requiring foresight as much as diligence. Yet despite this intricacy, the system held. Citizens across compliant worlds experienced the Imperium not as an abstraction, but as tangible presence, in standardized currency, in interstellar news relays, in the arrival of off-world goods that expanded daily life beyond local limitations. The shared identity of humanity, once an aspiration, had become a lived reality for billions. In such an environment, the notion of existential threat felt increasingly remote. And still, there were those who listened closely to the subtle changes in the galaxy's tone. Astropaths occasionally reported dreams that lingered with unusual intensity, images that did not fade with waking. Such experiences were discussed in medical terms, attributed to the strain of their unique role. Rest cycles were adjusted, choirs rotated more frequently. Officially, there was no cause for concern. Navigators, too, sometimes described fleeting impressions of unfamiliar currents brushing against known routes, like distant tides touching the edges of well-traveled seas. Their guild treated these accounts with cautious interest, refining charts and advising minor course alterations. Individually, none of these phenomena seemed significant. Together, they formed a pattern too diffuse to define, yet persistent enough to resist dismissal. Still, the Imperium's prevailing mood did not waver. Confidence had been built on centuries of success, and it endured through minor uncertainties. Humanity had reclaimed the stars through reason, discipline, and unity. It trusted in those strengths to guide it through whatever lay ahead. On observation decks overlooking the silent expanse, officers sometimes found themselves reflecting on the paradox of their time. The Imperium had never been so powerful, yet it also stood in relation to a cosmos that remained immeasurably vast. Knowledge had grown, but mystery had not diminished in equal measure. The Great Crusade continued, steady and purposeful, its fleets like arteries carrying life through a growing body. Victories were less dramatic now, integration more routine, but the sense of participating in a grand and lasting endeavor remained. And in the quiet spaces between the stars, where signals traveled as whispers across unimaginable distance, the galaxy held its deeper currents close, murmurs too faint to be named, yet present all the same, awaiting a future moment when they might rise from subtlety into undeniable form. By the time the Great Crusade had spanned generations, its motion no longer resembled a charge into the unknown, but a vast and deliberate unfolding. The Imperium's reach extended across regions once separated by fear and silence. Its presence was not merely seen in fleets and fortresses, but felt in the habits of daily life across innumerable worlds. Humanity had become accustomed to the idea of permanence. In the inner sectors, trade convoys moved with such regularity that their passage marked the calendar more reliably than planetary seasons. Astropathic choirs maintained a steady chorus of communication, their synchronized transmissions forming a constant, unseen lattice that bound distant populations together. Administrators processed petitions and reports with the assurance that the system around them would endure. The Legiones Astartes, though still vigilant, found their role evolving. Their campaigns were now often preemptive, aimed at preventing unrest rather than crushing established rebellion. The mere knowledge that a legion could be deployed was usually enough to maintain compliance. Their presence had become a symbol of unassailable authority. Among the Primarchs, this era fostered a quiet introspection. They had been created for conquest, for the reclamation of a scattered species. Now they found themselves overseeing the maturation of what they had helped build. Their conversations in war councils increasingly touch upon governance, succession of command structures, and the education of leaders who might one day guide the Imperium in less turbulent times. Horus, ever attentive to morale, encouraged this shift in perspective. He spoke of a future in which the Imperium would rely less on constant war and more on stable institutions. His vision was not of endless crusade, but of secured frontiers and flourishing worlds whose prosperity would make rebellion unthinkable. Such ideas resonated widely. After decades of relentless expansion, the notion of an era defined by preservation rather than conquest held deep appeal. Yet even as these hopes took root, subtle tensions stirred beneath the surface. The scale of the Imperium meant that no two regions were identical. Economic priorities varied. Cultural traditions, though increasingly interwoven, still influenced local governance. While the overarching framework remained unified, its application differed from sector to sector. These variations were manageable, but they required constant oversight and careful mediation. In distant command centers, messages sometimes arrived carrying concerns that defied simple categorization. Disputes between imperial agencies, disagreements over interpretation of doctrine, friction between military and civilian authorities. Each issue was addressed, resolved through established channels, and entered into the vast archive of administrative memory. Individually, they were minor. Collectively, they illustrated the delicate balance required to maintain cohesion across such immensity. Beyond the borders of well-charted space, exploratory missions continued to probe the unknown. Their findings grew more enigmatic. Regions of distorted stellar readings, areas where warp navigation became unusually unpredictable, and systems bearing signs of ancient, non-human occupation all entered Imperial records. These discoveries were studied with professional detachment, filed as challenges for future investigation. For now, they remained distant from the Imperium's core concerns. On Terra, the Emperor's endeavors remained shrouded in secrecy. Those few granted audience spoke of an intensity in his focus unlike anything seen before. He labored not on matters of immediate conquest, but on undertakings whose significance lay far beyond the horizon of current events. Trust in his purpose never wavered, yet the mystery surrounding his work deepened. In his relative absence from the Crusade's daily operations, the Primarchs bore increasing responsibility for interpreting and enacting his will. They did so with loyalty and pride, yet the weight of such trust was immense. Each decision carried the knowledge that it contributed to a design only partially visible. Among ordinary citizens, life continued with growing normalcy. Interstellar travel, once the realm of legend, became an accepted part of commerce and communication. Families traced their heritage across multiple worlds. Education emphasized humanity's shared origin and collective destiny. The Imperium was no longer an external authority. It was a context in which existence unfolded. And still, in the quiet intervals between routine transmissions and scheduled departures, there lingered a sense of suspension, as though the vast enterprise of the Great Crusade had reached a plateau, a momentary equilibrium before the next great shift. In observation domes aboard distant bastions, watch officers sometimes stood in silence, gazing at starfields unmarred by conflict. The void appeared calm, almost serene, its depths concealing whatever currents might yet move unseen. Instruments hummed steadily, registering no immediate threat. Such calm was reassuring. It affirmed the belief that the Imperium's foundations were sound, its trajectory secure. Yet calm can also precede change. The fleets remained vigilant. The legions stood ready. The Emperor's vision endured as a guiding star of human destiny. All the structures of unity, military, administrative, cultural, held firm, interlocked in design that seemed capable of withstanding any strain. And so the Imperium rested, not in complacency, but in poised assurance, like a great vessel gliding across still waters beneath a sky of silent stars, unaware that beyond the horizon, unseen forces gathered, patient and inevitable, awaiting the moment when stillness would give way to motion once more. As the Great Crusade entered its second decade of continuous expansion, the Imperium had achieved a measure of order that few could have imagined during the early, chaotic years of rediscovery. Vast sectors had been surveyed, linked, and brought into compliance, their inhabitants increasingly accustomed to the structures and rituals that bound them to terror and to each other. Trade flowed with regularity. Communication channels carried messages across light years with unprecedented speed, and the Legiones Astartes maintained a quiet authority that seemed unassailable. Yet even in this age of apparent stability, shadows lingered at the edges of human perception. These were not the shadows of open conflict or immediate threat, but the subtlest shadows that accompany expansion, uncertainty, distance, and the inherent limitations of understanding across such immense scales. Exploratory fleets continued to push into the periphery, seeking worlds uncharted by imperial hands. They encountered anomalies that defied simple interpretation, stars whose output fluctuated in ways instruments could not fully explain, gravitic disturbances that skewed sensor readings, and planets marked by structures of unknown origin, ancient and vast, silent witnesses to civilizations long extinct. Each discovery was logged meticulously, yet each also served as a reminder that humanity's understanding of the galaxy remained incomplete. Among the Primarchs, discussions began to reflect the growing complexity of managing an Imperium stretched across millions of light-years. They deliberated not only on military strategy, but on governance, resource allocation, and the careful integration of disparate human cultures. The role of a Primarch had evolved beyond that of warlord. It now encompassed the duties of legislator, diplomat, and custodian of civilization. Horus, in particular, demonstrated a keen awareness of these demands. His campaigns were measured, his judgment tempered by reflection as well as experience. He emphasized coordination between legions and civilian administrators, seeking to ensure that conquest translated into lasting unity rather than ephemeral compliance. To him, the strength of the Imperium lay not solely in firepower, but in cohesion, a network of systems, populations, and leaders aligned in purpose. Even so, the galaxy reminded the Crusade of its underlying vastness. In certain sectors, navigators reported subtle inconsistencies in warp currents, minute shift that required careful recalibration. While never catastrophic, these anomalies demanded attention, lest overconfidence lead to miscalculation. Astropaths occasionally transmitted images or impressions that left the crew uneasy, fleeting visions of unknown forms, a phenomena beyond understanding. Most of these incidents were absorbed into the routine of administration and fleet coordination, catalogued and archived without alarm. Yet their accumulation formed an almost imperceptible tension, a whisper that even in this age of triumph, the unknown still held sway. On planets newly brought into imperial order, ordinary life continued to thrive. Urban centers expanded with disciplined planning, agricultural world produced surpluses to feed distant garrisons, and commerce linked previously isolated societies into a functioning web of interdependence. Children learned histories that emphasized unity and shared destiny, while the older generations adapted to new governance and ways of life. Cultural convergence was gradual, but undeniable. The Imperium was becoming not only a political entity, but a civilization with coherence across thousands of worlds. And yet, as civilization matured, so too did the awareness of responsibility. Administrative councils wrestled with questions of sustainability and endurance, how to maintain order across regions separated by vast distances, how to safeguard critical systems, and how to anticipate challenges that might emerge centuries in the future. The scale of the Imperium was both its strength and its constant challenge. Among the legions, training became as important as combat. Astartes' attachment spent months refining maneuvers, integrating newly reinforced technologies, and mentoring successor squads. Their presence in a system was a stabilizing force, yet it was also a reminder of the weight of duty that accompanied authority. They were living embodiments of the Emperor's vision, instruments of conquest, but also of guardianship. Even the Emperor, distant on Terra, remained a constant presence in thought and purpose. The Primarchs often contemplated the silent guidance he provided, the sense that every action was part of a larger design whose full scope none could yet comprehend. His absence from active campaigns was not perceived as neglect, but as necessity, a focus on works that required solitude and foresight beyond the understanding of others. Despite all progress, small fissures began to show in the grand edifice. Minor conflict between sectors, discrepancies in tithes, delays in reinforcement fleets, each resolved without significant consequence, yet each illustrating the subtle fragility inherent in managing such vast systems. The Imperium was formidable, yet it remained dependent on vigilance, judgment, and the loyalty of those charged with its care. And so the Crusade advanced, a network of fleets and worlds moving as one under distant authority. Triumphs were measured not only in planets claimed, but in systems stabilized, populations integrated, and infrastructure established. Victory had taken on a quieter, more enduring quality, focused on permanence rather than spectacle. In the stillness between campaigns, officers and scholars often paused to reflect on the magnitude of what had been accomplished. The stars outside observation decks gleamed like distant lanterns, silent witnesses to human perseverance and ambition. The Imperium appeared eternal, unshakable, and yet the calm of this age carried with it an unspoken truth, that even the greatest works are never free from the possibility of challenge, that the vastness of the galaxy always harbors currents unseen and forces yet unknown. And so Chapter 11 concludes in a gentle, reflective pause, the Imperium vast, disciplined, and triumphant, yet quietly reminded that every structure, no matter how immense, exists within a cosmos of endless depth and subtle, patient motion. As the Great Crusade continued its expansion, the Imperium had matured into a structure of remarkable scale and cohesion. Fleets traversed the stars with rhythmic precision, carrying fleets of transports, armed escorts, and the towering legions Astartes across systems that had once been isolated, their societies unknowable to outsiders. Humanity, once scattered and fragile, now moved as a vast, interconnected organism, its pulse measured by the hum of void engines and the steady cadence of warp-transmitted messages. In this age, the role of leadership extended beyond conquest. Primarchs no longer measured success solely in the subjugation of worlds or the routing of hostile forces. They became arbiters of integration, balancing the demands of administration, diplomacy, and culture across countless populations. Each decision could ripple across sectors, influencing prosperity, loyalty, and even morale. Their judgments were informed by centuries of accumulated knowledge, yet they were also shaped by instinct, the intuition of beings engineered to guide humanity with clarity and authority. Horus, as the Emperor's favored, often coordinated the most complex operations. His understanding of the delicate interplay between force and persuasion ensured that worlds were brought into compliance without unnecessary devastation. The Crusade's objective was no longer solely expansion for its own sake. It had evolved into the creation of permanence, the weaving of humanity into a fabric strong enough to endure across millennia. And yet, for all the achievements of the Crusade, the galaxy retained its vastness and mystery. Exploratory vessels regularly reported phenomena that confounded simple classification. Currents within the warp that shifted unexpectedly, planets whose ecosystems evolved in rapid, unpredictable cycles, and ruins of civilizations whose scale and complexity defied human comprehension. Each anomaly was logged and studied, yet none suggested imminent threat, merely a reminder that the universe was older and more intricate than even the Emperor's design might account for. In the quieter sectors, life had begun to normalize under imperial governance. Administrators oversaw cities whose grids and districts reflected standardized planning, while agricultural world produced surpluses that flowed seamlessly to distant garrisons. Markets functioned efficiently, trade routes remained reliable, and the rhythms of civilian life were punctuated by ceremonies celebrating loyalty, achievement, and unity. Children learned histories emphasizing human triumph and shared destiny, and even in isolated regions, populations began to perceive themselves as part of a larger whole. Yet within this harmony, subtle tensions emerged. Cultural traditions persisted, sometimes clashing with standardized doctrine. Local governors occasionally advocated for unique approaches to resource management or security, testing the flexibility of imperial policy. Even among the legions, differences in philosophy surfaced. Some emphasized strict adherence to central command, while others trusted local initiative and adaptation. These variations were managed carefully, often resolved through councils and mediation, yet they highlighted the inherent challenge of sustaining unity across a galaxy of such immensity. The warp remained both a tool and a variable. While astropaths and navigators had refined the use of translation currents, there were instances of unexpected delays or distortions. Routes long deemed stable occasionally required adjustments, and fleets sometimes emerged from translation ahead of schedule, only to find subtle anomalies in sensor readings. Such occurrences were catalogued and analyzed, rarely alarming in themselves, yet they formed a quiet undercurrent of caution for those charged with the Crusade's success. Within the legions, training continued relentlessly, even in the absence of immediate battle. Veterans refined techniques, mentored newer recruits, and maintained the discipline that made the Astartes both feared and revered. Their presence on compliant worlds served as a deterrent, yet it also became an instrument of integration, demonstrating to populations a tangible embodiment of the Emperor's will. Horus often reminded his fellow Primarchs that the purpose of their work was not merely control, but cultivation. Planets, once reclaimed, needed guidance to flourish. Populations, once unified, required steady reinforcement of shared identity. Without such care, conquest alone would achieve little permanence. Across the sectors, small disruptions continued to test imperial systems. Minor rebellions were quelled swiftly, logistical errors corrected with precision, and anomalous warp currents studied for patterns. Individually, these incidents were trivial. Collectively, they served as a reminder that even the most disciplined structure must remain vigilant. The galaxy's vastness ensured that certainty could never be absolute. Even in the relative calm between campaigns, the leaders of the Crusade understood the responsibility inherent in their reach. Decisions made in the quiet of council chambers could determine the stability of systems light years away. Every dispatch, every decree, every adjustment in fleet rotation carried weight. And yet, in the vast stretches of star-strewn emptiness, there was also room for reflection. Officers, navigators, and citizens alike occasionally observed the universe not as a map to be conquered, but as a panorama of timeless immensity. In these moments, the success of the Crusade was measured not in expansion alone, but in the quiet endurance of order across a cosmos that might otherwise have remained indifferent. The Imperium continued its steady progression, combining diligence, loyalty, and foresight into a lattice of human achievement that reached from the heart of Terra to the furthest sectors under its control. Triumphs were measured in stability as much as conquest, in cohesion as much as speed, in foresight as much as action. And so the Great Crusade moved onward, a careful, relentless tide, aware of the galaxy's depth, yet confident in the structures, the loyalty, and the discipline that had brought humanity from scattered worlds to a position of enduring ascendancy. In the stillness between fleets, as stars drifted silently past observation windows, the Imperium rested in purpose, poised for the moments yet to come, and yet quietly mindful of the currents that flowed unseen beneath the surface of the known universe. By this stage of the Great Crusade, the Imperium had become a presence whose scale was difficult to grasp even for those who commanded its greatest fleets. Star systems numbered in the thousands had been surveyed, catalogued, and brought into compliance. Trade, communication, and military coordination had reached a level of sophistication that seemed, to many, almost effortless, the result of decades of disciplined expansion, meticulous planning, and the tireless work of millions across innumerable worlds. Yet even amid such apparent mastery, the limitations imposed by distance and scale became increasingly visible. The farther a fleet traveled from the inner sphere, the more isolated it became. A command vessel operating on the fringes of imperial space might be light years from the nearest support, relying on warp currents that could shift unpredictably. Decisions made in these remote sectors carried consequences that reverberated across entire regions, and the burden of judgment rested heavily upon those present to act. Horus, aware of these pressures, emphasized foresight and coordination among his fellow Primarchs. He counseled patience in the application of force, advocating that newly contacted populations be observed and studied as much as subdued. A world's compliance, he argued, was only meaningful if it endured, maintained not through fear alone, but through the establishment of systems that allowed humanity to function and thrive. In this context, the Legiones Astartes operated as both instrument and symbol. Their campaigns were decisive, but rarely indiscriminate. They were capable of overwhelming force, yet they often served to enforce stability, oversee infrastructure, and integrate civilian governance into the larger imperial framework. Their presence alone was frequently sufficient to maintain order, a reminder of both authority and expectation. Exploratory operations in the outermost regions highlighted the vastness of the galaxy and the limits of knowledge. Teams encountered planets whose ecosystems operated under unfamiliar rules, where gravity, atmospheric composition, or orbital cycles challenged standard assumptions. Astropathic signals sometimes carried fragmented impressions of civilizations long vanished, and ancient ruins suggested the rise and fall of powers whose scale rivaled or exceeded that of humanity. Each discovery was catalogued meticulously, forming a record of patterns and anomalies that would guide future decisions. Yet the vast majority of these encounters produced no immediate threat, only the quiet reminder that certainty, even in triumph, was always provisional. The administration of compliant worlds remained a central concern. Populations integrated into the Imperium grew accustomed to standardized governance, education, and culture, yet old customs persisted subtly beneath the surface. Sector governors and local leaders were required to navigate these complexities carefully, balancing respect for tradition with the implementation of imperial norms. Failure to do so could result in unrest or inefficiency, even on worlds otherwise loyal for generations. Within councils of the Primarchs, the question of sustainability became increasingly pressing. How could the Imperium ensure cohesion across sectors separated by incomprehensible distances? How could supply lines be protected against delays or unforeseen interference? How might populations maintain faith in distant authority when direct observation of the Emperor's will was impossible? These questions were discussed in measured tones, approached not with panic, but with deliberate calculation. Even in this period of reflection, subtle currents of tension appeared in minor reports. Small rebellions were rare but instructive. Logistical errors occasionally disrupted the smooth flow of resources. Navigators reported faint disturbances in warp currents that could alter long-established routes. While none of these phenomena threatened the Imperium outright, they served as reminders of the fragility inherent in maintaining such an immense structure. Despite these challenges, confidence remained pervasive. The Imperium's expansion was no longer a matter of speculation. It was a matter of record. Worlds had been transformed. Fleets moved predictably, and the Legiones Astartes operated with unparalleled efficiency. The Emperor's vision, though distant and partially inscrutable, was manifest in every compliant system, every secured trade route, and every fleet patrolling the void. For those who observed from command decks, the immensity of their work was both humbling and affirming. They witnessed the practical effects of centuries of coordination, planets thriving under structured governance, fleets traversing warp corridors without incident, populations unified not by coercion alone, but by the shared experience of belonging to a greater whole. Yet even in this confidence, a quiet awareness persisted, that the Imperium's reach, though vast, had limits, that the galaxy, older than humanity and indifferent to its ambitions, held complexities beyond immediate understanding. That vigilance, discipline, and foresight would always be required to maintain stability. And so, the Great Crusade pressed onward. New worlds were surveyed, integrated, and secured. Fleets moved in concert with measured precision, and Legiones Astartes continued to embody both martial supremacy and the principle of guardianship. Civilization advanced in both scope and stability, yet the vastness of the cosmos reminded all that mastery, however thorough, was never complete. In the quiet moments aboard observation platforms, officers and citizens alike could look out upon star fields that stretched beyond comprehension, noting the serene light of distant suns. The Imperium's victories were tangible, its system coherent, its authority unchallenged in most regions. Yet the silence of the galaxy carried a subtle message, that no structure, however grand, exists outside the larger currents of time, space, and history. And in that stillness, the crusade continued, steadfast, disciplined, and vigilant, moving through the stars with the measured certainty of a force aware of both its achievements and the infinite depths that yet remain beyond its grasp. In the far reaches of the Great Crusade, where the pulse of the Imperium slowed to a measured rhythm, there emerged a subtle awareness among commanders and governors alike. The galaxy, vast and ancient, had its own quiet tendencies, currents that shifted without announcement, and patterns that human calculation could perceive but not fully predict. It was a region of stars where success and order were the default expectation, yet where vigilance remained the silent companion of every decision. Exploratory fleets continued to chart systems that had never felt human presence. They recorded planets rich in resources, yet sometimes rendered inaccessible by environmental extremes, gravity too dense, atmosphere volatile, or radiation unpredictable. Instruments occasionally transmitted readings that contradicted prior assumptions, or produced data that could not be immediately interpreted. Astropathic signals, though generally consistent, sometimes carried faint impressions of phenomena so subtle that only prolonged observation could reveal them. These nuances reminded commanders that even the most orderly regions contained elements beyond comprehension, and that stability required constant attention. The Legiones Astartes, embodiments of discipline and martial perfection, were frequently called to enforce order or to oversee integration of newly compliant systems. Their campaigns had evolved from immediate conflict into a combination of presence, guidance, and deterrence. On worlds recently brought into compliance, Astartes patrols demonstrated both the overwhelming power of the Emperor's will and the practical framework of imperial order. The soldiers' conduct emphasized not mere conquest, but integration. Cities stabilized, trade corridors secured, populations instructed in the expectations of governance. Horus, moving between sectors, maintained a careful balance between oversight and delegation. He trusted his fellow Primarchs to act decisively, yet he also insisted upon communication, coordination, and periodic review of strategy. Decisions were made with the understanding that one miscalculation could echo across a dozen systems, affecting supply lines, morale, and the perception of the Imperium itself. His guidance, measured and deliberate, fostered unity among the commanders who bore the heaviest responsibilities of expansion. Among civilian administrators and sector governors, daily life was increasingly structured. Commerce, agriculture, and civic management proceeded with regularity, reinforced by the subtle presence of imperial law. Education focused on the shared identity of humanity, and religious superstition, once pervasive, was gradually supplanted by the rational principles of the imperial truth. Yet despite these measures, local variations persisted. Dialects, rituals, and customs adapted slowly, sometimes bending the rigid structures imposed from terror. These were not failures, but features, a recognition that integration required respect for history and context, even as uniformity was enforced. Even within the warp, the currents remained capricious. Astropathic messages occasionally experienced brief distortions, subtle enough to suggest interference yet too minor to constitute immediate danger. Navigators noted shifts in the immaterium that required minor adjustments to planned routes. While these variations were handled without disruption, they served as a quiet reminder that even the most stable corridors of the void were subject to forces beyond comprehension. Reports occasionally arrived from distant systems of minor unrest, localized uprisings, or deviations from expected resource output. These incidents were swiftly managed, often by a combination of Imperial Army detachments, Astartes oversight, and civil mediation. They were reminders that human populations, though broadly compliant, required attention, that stability was not solely maintained through strength but through understanding, anticipation, and subtle guidance. Even as the Imperium's physical presence expanded, its leaders remained aware of the intellectual and moral foundations necessary to sustain order. Councils of Primarchs, senior governors, and military commanders deliberated on principles of governance, the distribution of responsibility, and the cultivation of loyalty across light years of distance. Success was no longer measured solely in planets annexed or fleets deployed. It was measured in cohesion, longevity, and the quiet endurance of compliance and trust. Horus often reflected on the duality of his role, the necessity of decisive action tempered by the cultivation of stability. A planet might be conquered in a single day, yet its integration required years of guidance, observation, and adaptation. The legions, powerful and disciplined, were instruments not only of war but of long-term maintenance, embodiment of both authority and the potential for patience. The Emperor's distant influence remained the ultimate guiding force. Commands, though infrequent, carried clarity and weight. His vision was understood in fragments by those who implemented it, yet the totality of his purpose remained beyond immediate grasp. This distance reinforced the responsibility of the Primarchs and their commanders to act in alignment with a plan larger than any single system, fleet, or population can encompass. Despite this measured confidence, the galaxy retained its vastness, its indifference, and its subtle resistance to human assumptions. The further the crusade extended, the more apparent became the limitations of foresight, the ever-present possibility of unforeseen challenge. Minor anomalies, subtle distortions, and faintly observed irregularities persisted, requiring careful recording and continued vigilance. And so, the Great Crusade moved forward, not with the breathless urgency of its earliest campaigns, but with a deliberate, patient rhythm of a civilization extending its influence across the stars. Triumphs were quieter now, measured in stability and integration rather than conquest alone. The Imperium, immense and disciplined, pressed outward, aware of the subtle forces at play and committed to maintaining order across its ever-expanding dominion. In the quiet moments aboard command bridges and observation decks, as fleets glided past distant suns and nebulae shimmered faintly against the void, officers reflected on the vastness that surrounded them. The galaxy's immensity was humbling, yet the Imperium moved through it with purpose, measured precision, and a steady, enduring resolve. And in that space, between worlds and between stars, the Great Crusade rested briefly in its uncertainty, yet with a quiet acknowledgment of the currents of the void, unseen and patient, were ever present, awaiting the moment when subtle forces might once more shape the course of human destiny. By the time the Great Crusade had spanned decades, the Imperium of Man had become a structure of immense scale and careful order, its presence felt across countless star systems, each linked by fleets, warp routes, and the unbroken chain of command that stretched from Terra to the farthest sectors. Humanity, once scattered and vulnerable, had grown into a coherent, disciplined civilization whose rhythm was measured by the movement of fleets, the flow of resources, and the steady vigilance of the Legiones Astartes. Even in this age of apparent stability, there remained a subtle awareness among the commanders and governors of the Imperium. The galaxy was vast, ancient, and unpredictable. Distance imposed its own limitations, and the further a system lay from the core of human influence, the more isolated it became. Messages required days, weeks, or even months to traverse light years of space, and even the warp, though harnessed with increasing skill, retained its inherent volatility. The Imperium's dominion, though impressive, was never absolute. It was an ever-maintained equilibrium, fragile only in the smallest measure. Exploratory fleets continued to push into regions uncharted by human knowledge. They found planets rich in resources, sometimes uninhabited, other times bearing ruins of civilizations long extinct. Some worlds challenged expectations entirely. Atmospheric anomalies, unusual stellar alignments, or gravitational peculiarities demanded constant adjustment and careful observation. Astropathic transmissions occasionally conveyed impressions that were fragmentary or puzzling, subtle echoes of phenomena beyond human comprehension. These instances, though minor in isolation, formed an ongoing reminder that the universe was not entirely knowable, that even the most disciplined efforts could only partially impose order upon its vastness. The Legiones Astartes remained the most visible instrument of imperial authority. Their campaigns, now conducted with measured precision, emphasized not only the subjugation of hostile forces, but also the stabilization and integration of newly compliant worlds. Patrols, training exercises, and oversight of planetary infrastructure combined with the presence of overwhelming martial capability to ensure that the populations of the Imperium internalize the principles of loyalty, duty, and shared purpose. Even the smallest garrison of Astartes could establish a sense of permanence, reinforcing the emperors without the need for extended conflict. Horus, overseeing multiple sectors, exemplified the dual responsibilities of leadership, the projection of decisive force and the cultivation of enduring stability. He balanced rapid intervention where necessary with patient observation, ensuring that worlds under imperial control were not only secured but guided toward functional self-governance under the frameworks imposed from Terra. Compliance, he reminded those under his command, was meaningful only when it endured across generations. Despite the outward appearance of control, subtle disturbances persisted. Navigators recorded minor anomalies in warp currents, astropaths transmitted fleeting impressions that lack immediate interpretation, and minor administrative disputes occasionally flared between governors or sector officials. Individually, these incidents were trivial. Collectively, They illustrated that the Imperium's structure, while vast and disciplined, depended upon constant attention and fidelity of countless individuals across incomprehensible distances. On planets long integrated into the Imperium, daily life reflected the steady influence of governance, education, and culture. Trade functioned smoothly. Citizens adhered to the dictates of law, and military oversight ensured stability. Yet old customs and traditions remained, often quietly influencing local practices. The administrators of the Imperium approached these deviations pragmatically, understanding that integration was as much a matter of patience as of enforcement. Human culture, despite the unifying structures of the Emperor's vision, retained subtle resilience. Even the Emperor's distant presence exerted profound influence. Commands received were concise and precise, yet the broader intent behind them was often interpreted through the judgment of the Primarchs. The weight of understanding the Emperor's vision and translating it into action across sectors of varying complexity became a central challenge of leadership. Each decision, from fleet deployment to resource allocation, carried potential consequences stretching across light years, generations, and human lives. Amid this complexity, the Imperium's successes were undeniable. Worlds were secured, populations integrated, trade corridors maintained, and fleets operated with near-perfect synchronization. The Legiones Astartes remained vigilant, their discipline a living example of the Emperor's authority and potential humanity elevated. Civilization itself moved forward, expanding its scope and depth, confident in its systems and structure. Yet, in the stillness between campaigns, in the moments when observation decks overlooked silent starfields, a quiet truth remained visible. The galaxy was indifferent to human ambition. Vast stretches of space carried no allegiance, no guidance, no preference for order over chaos. The Imperium's dominion, immense though it was, existed only by constant effort, vigilance, and foresight. Even minor deviations, if neglected, could ripple outward with consequences unforeseen. Thus, the Crusade pressed onward, disciplined, purposeful, and aware of both its achievements and its limitations. The victories of the past decades had solidified human dominion over countless systems, yet they did not render the future certain. The vast, patient currents of the galaxy moved beyond human reckoning, silent and persistent, shaping the potential for challenge in ways that could only be anticipated, never fully controlled. And so, as fleets glided across starlit voids and the hum of engines resonated through observation holes, the Imperium rested not in complacency, but in poised vigilance. Triumphs had been won, civilization secured, and the Emperor's vision realized in countless forms, yet the cosmos remained vast, ancient, and enigmatic. Within that expanse, the Great Crusade continued, measured, deliberate, and unwavering, moving across the horizon of impermanence, aware that every achievement carried the quiet weight of responsibility, and that the galaxy's subtle forces would always demand attention, patience, and unbroken resolve.